There's a small metal object sitting on a shelf in thousands of American garages right now, spinning nothing, connected to nothing, doing absolutely nothing, and most people walk past it a dozen times a year without a second glance. It looks like scrap. It sounds like scrap when you tap it. It weighs like scrap. And yet collectors around the country are actively hunting for exactly this kind of object, checking flea markets, estate sales, and dusty garage shelves for the handful of details that separate genuine junk from something worth real money. We're talking about old electric motors and the small machines built around them. Desk fans, sewing machine motors, shop tool motors, washing machine motors, vacuum cleaner motors, phonograph motors, the humming metal guts of everyday appliances that used to run American households before everything went plastic and disposable. If you've ever inherited a workbench, cleaned out a relative's garage, or bought an older house with a shed full of leave-it-it's junk items, there's a real chance you've already handled one of these without knowing it. Think about your own garage for a second. Is there an old desk fan sitting in the corner, the kind with a heavy round base and blades that look like they're made of something other than plastic? Is there a box of old motors pulled off broken appliances decades ago because someone thought this might be useful someday? Is there an ancient sewing machine tucked under a bench, the electric cord long since cut off, sitting there because nobody wanted to be the one who threw out Grandma's machine? Is there an old vacuum cleaner in the back of a closet that hasn't run since the Ford administration, kept around out of some vague sense of guilt about throwing away something that still technically has a motor in it? These objects survive specifically because they seem worthless. Nobody bothers stealing a heavy old motor. Nobody bothers hauling it to the dump either, because it's inconvenient and heavy and vaguely feels like it might still be good for something. So it sits, for decades, untouched, which is exactly the kind of survival story collectors love, because it means original, unrestored examples are still out there, waiting in ordinary homes instead of locked away in museums or private collections that never see daylight. Before we start counting down, it helps to understand why old motors carry any value at all, because on the surface, this seems like the least glamorous category of collectible imaginable. Nobody puts a motor on a mantelpiece the way they display a piece of pottery or a painting. So why does an entire hobby community exist around these things? The answer is a combination of design history, engineering craftsmanship, and pure mechanical romance. Early electric motors were not mass-produced disposable parts, stamped out by the millions with no attention paid to how they looked or how long they'd last. They were built during a period when electricity in the home was still a novelty, when a company's name cast directly into the housing was a mark of pride rather than a legal formality, and when a motor genuinely had to be over-engineered because there was no guarantee of consistent voltage or reliable power quality coming through the wires. That over-engineering is exactly why so many of these things still run today. Generations later, if you clean them up, replace the wiring, and give the bearings some fresh oil. Collectors are drawn to that combination of aesthetics and mechanical honesty: brass, iron, hand-finished castings, exposed mechanisms you can actually study, understand, and take apart without needing a computer diagnostic tool. It's the complete opposite of a sealed plastic modern motor that you're not even supposed to open, let alone repair. And because so many old motors were scrapped for their metal content during wartime salvage drives, or simply discarded once newer, lighter, quieter models hit the market, genuinely early and complete examples have become considerably harder to find than most people would assume. One important thing to understand right away, before we get into specific objects, is that value in this category depends enormously on completeness, originality, manufacturer, and condition. It also depends heavily on physical weight and size, which is a detail most people never think about until they try to actually sell one of these things. A small, light, complete, brass-accented motor from a desk fan behaves completely differently in the collector market than a massive industrial motor that once ran a lathe or a line of shop machinery. Shipping a heavy iron motor across the country can easily cost more than the motor itself would sell for, which means bigger, heavier pieces often end up trading locally for modest prices even when they're genuinely historically significant, simply because the logistics of moving them work against the seller. Meanwhile, a small, light motor with the right pedigree can travel anywhere in a padded box for a few dollars in postage, opening it up to a national or even international pool of buyers. Keep that distinction in mind as we go through this list, because bigger is not always more valuable here. Sometimes the opposite is true, and it's one of the more counterintuitive lessons this category teaches. It's also worth understanding, before we begin, how these collector communities actually operate, because they're more organized than most people would expect. There are dedicated antique fan collector associations that hold annual shows where members bring restored pieces to display and trade. There are sewing machine collector groups obsessed with matching original components to specific machine models. There are industrial antique enthusiasts who specifically hunt down early electrical equipment the way other people hunt down vintage cars. These aren't casual eBay browsers stumbling onto a listing. These are specialists who know exact model numbers, exact production date ranges, and exact original paint colors for pieces most of us would take one look at and immediately throw in a scrap pile. That specialist knowledge is precisely why an object that looks like nothing to an untrained eye can suddenly become desirable the moment it crosses paths with the right buyer. Number 10 on our list, and a genuinely surprising place to start, is the old vacuum cleaner motor, specifically motors from upright and canister vacuums built in the early to mid-20th century, back when vacuum cleaners were built to be repaired rather than replaced. Most people look at an old vacuum cleaner sitting in a closet and see nothing but a dead appliance taking up space, something destined for the curb the next time someone finally gets around to a real cleanout. But vintage vacuum cleaner collecting is a genuine, if niche, hobby, and certain early models from well-known manufacturers are actively sought after, particularly ones with intact original motors, original decorative metal housings, and original nameplates. The identification clue here starts with the housing itself, since early vacuum cleaners often used decorative stamped or cast metal bodies rather than the molded plastic shells that came later, and the manufacturer's name typically appears prominently on a badge or embossed directly into the metal. Look closely at the motor compartment for a smaller secondary tag listing horsepower and amperage, since these details help specialists date a specific production run. Condition assessment focuses on whether the motor still spins freely, whether the original cloth-covered power cord survives even if it's no longer safe to plug in, and whether the original attachments and bag survive alongside the main unit. Since a complete set with all its original accessories is worth considerably more than a bare motor housing missing everything else. Rust on the housing, a cracked or replaced power cord, and non-original replacement parts all work against value, while an untouched example with original finish and a motor that turns freely by hand represents exactly what specialist collectors are hoping to find when they dig through an estate sale box marked "Old Vacuum Works" in faded marker. Number 9 is the old desk and floor fan motor, specifically the brass blade fans made in the early 20th century by companies that most people have heard of but wouldn't necessarily connect to fans. If you've ever seen an old fan with a heavy cast iron base, a round motor housing, and blades that gleam like polished brass instead of dull aluminum or plastic, you were looking at a motor built before roughly 1930, when brass blades were standard before manufacturers largely switched over to steel and aluminum construction. People tend to ignore these fans because they don't work safely with modern outlets without rewiring. They're heavy. They look old-fashioned sitting next to modern appliances, and most families eventually replace them with lighter, quieter, safer models decades ago, relegating the old ones to storage rather than the trash simply because they seem too solid and well-made to throw away. But collectors specifically seek out early brass blade examples, often prizing originality over restoration, because an untouched fan with its original paint and finish tells a more complete and historically accurate story than one that's been repainted or refinished by a well-meaning but uninformed owner. The identification clue here is on the badge or nameplate riveted to the motor housing, which usually names the manufacturer and sometimes includes a patent date or model number stamped directly into the metal. Different manufacturers use distinct styles of switch knobs, oscillating mechanisms, and cage designs, and experienced collectors can often date a fan within a few years just by studying these small details, the same way a car enthusiast can date a vehicle by its tie. Light shape. Condition matters enormously here. Original paint in good shape, intact blades with no bent or reshaped tips, a wire cage that hasn't been crushed or replaced, and a motor that still spins freely when you turn the blades by hand all push value upward significantly. Rust pitting on the cast iron base, replaced or mismatched blades, non-original hardware, and evidence of amateur repainting all push value back down. Common examples in rough condition might be worth little more than decorative value at a flea market, while rarer models in excellent original condition, particularly certain early configurations from well-known manufacturers, can command genuinely serious money among fan collectors. A surprisingly organized and passionate hobby community, complete with regional shows, swap meets, and specialist blogs dedicated entirely to dating and identifying these machines. Number 8 is the small utility motor pulled from an old power tool, the kind of object you find sitting alone in a coffee can or on a shelf. Disconnected from whatever drill press, grinder, or saw it once powered, its original host machine long since scrapped or lost to time. These get ignored constantly because they look like nothing. Just a cylindrical iron or steel housing with two shafts sticking out, maybe some old wiring hanging off the back, tossed in a bin with other might need it someday parts. But certain early tool motors, especially ones from manufacturers who later became major industrial names still recognized today, are sought after by people restoring vintage power tools to original, working, period-correct condition. If you've got an old tool motor sitting around, check for a stamped or cast nameplate, since the manufacturer name and horsepower rating usually appear directly on the housing itself rather than on a separate paper label that would have long since disintegrated. Restorers of vintage tools often need exactly this kind of motor to complete an otherwise finished restoration project, which means an isolated motor that matches a well-known vintage tool model can be worth considerably more to the right specialized buyer than its scrap weight would suggest to anyone just looking at a pile of old iron. Condition concerns here focus on whether the windings are intact and free of visible burn damage, whether the shaft turns freely without excessive resistance or grinding, and whether the housing has cracks or heavy corrosion that would compromise a restoration. A motor that still spins smoothly by hand, even without being tested electrically, is far more desirable to a restorer than one that's seized solid or shows obvious internal damage, since a seized motor often means a costly and difficult rewind rather than a simple cleaning and lubrication job. Number 7 is the old sewing machine motor, a small, boxy attachment that was bolted to the side or underneath a treadle sewing machine when households converted from foot power to electric power sometime in the early to mid-20th century. These motors are everywhere in garages and basements because sewing machines themselves were kept for generations, passed down from mother to daughter, and eventually retired to storage rather than thrown away, treated almost like family heirlooms even when nobody in the household still sews. People overlook the motor specifically because the sewing machine itself gets all the attention and sentimental value, while the little motor bolted to the side seems like an afterthought, an ugly accessory rather than the main event. But collectors of vintage sewing machines actively hunt for period-correct motors to complete restorations, especially motors that match a specific brand and model of machine exactly. A motor from a particular manufacturer mounted on a matching machine of the correct era, complete with its original knee lever or foot pedal control, original cloth-covered wiring, and matching finish, holds noticeably more value as a complete set than a mismatched motor bolted onto the wrong machine by a previous owner who just wanted something that worked. The identification clue is straightforward once you know to look for it. Check for a stamped serial number or model designation on the motor housing itself, separate and distinct from the sewing machine's own serial number, since collectors use these secondary numbers to confirm authenticity and pin down an exact production date range. Frayed original cloth-covered wiring is extremely common on these motors, and while it makes the motor genuinely unsafe to plug in without professional rewiring, it doesn't necessarily hurt collector value since originality is often prized over immediate usability among serious collectors who understand what they're buying. What does hurt value is a replaced motor of the wrong type entirely, mismatched paint between motor and machine, or missing components like the original pedal or knee control, since a partial or mismatched sedu P breaks the historical continuity that collectors are specifically paying a premium for. Number 6 is the belt-driven shop motor, a larger, heavier piece of equipment that once sat bolted to a workbench or wall bracket, connected by a leather or rubber belt to line shafting that powered multiple tools in an old workshop setup. Back when a single central motor would drive an entire row of machines through a network of belts and pulleys rather than each tool having its own individual motor built in. These were common before individually motorized tools became standard and affordable. And if you've got an older property with a barn, shop, or garage that was once used for genuine trade work, there's a real chance one of these is still bolted to a wall or sitting forgotten in a corner, half buried under decades of unrelated clutter. People ignore them because they're heavy, dirty, streaked with old grease, and disconnected from any obvious modern use, since almost nobody runs a line shaft workshop anymore. But collectors of industrial and mechanical antiques are specifically drawn to belt-driven motors from certain well-regarded early electrical manufacturers, prizing them both for their genuine mechanical history and for their sculptural, almost architectural appearance when cleaned up and displayed. The identification clue is the cast nameplate, often with raised lettering cast directly into the housing rather than stamped onto a thin, separate plate that could fall off or corrode away, which usually lists horsepower, manufacturer name, and sometimes a patent or production date. Condition assessment here focuses heavily on whether the internal windings have survived intact and whether the bearings still turn smoothly with minimal play, since these motors are large and complex enough that a full restoration can become a genuinely significant undertaking involving specialized knowledge most casual owners simply don't have. As mentioned earlier, weight is the double-edged sword throughout this entire category, and it applies especially strongly here. A motor's collector interest can be very real and well documented, but its practical resale value is often capped locally because shipping something this heavy across the country frequently costs more than the motor itself would ultimately sell for, meaning the best outcomes for these pieces often involve local sales, regional shows, or patient searching for a buyer within reasonable driving distance. Number 5 is the washing machine motor, specifically motors salvaged from wringer-style washing machines that were standard equipment in American homes before fully automatic machines took over the laundry room entirely. These motors sometimes ended up repurposed for other jobs around a property, pressed into service, powering everything from homemade grinding wheels to improvised farm equipment. And other times they were simply pulled off a dead washing machine and set aside because they still worked and seemed too good to throw straight into the trash. This is one of the more overlooked motor types in this entire list, because washing machine components in general don't carry the same immediate visual charm as a polished brass fan or an ornate industrial motor with elegant cast lettering. But collectors of vintage laundry equipment and restorers working on wringer washers actively look for period-correct motors to complete otherwise finished restorations. And a motor that matches a specific well-known washing machine brand and era can genuinely be difficult to source, since so many were scrapped once the appliance itself broke down or was replaced. The identification clue is usually a small brass or aluminum tag riveted directly to the motor casing, listing manufacturer, horsepower, and sometimes the specific washing machine model it was originally designed to power. Rust on the housing is common and largely expected given how these machines lived their working lives in damp basements and laundry rooms. So light surface rust isn't automatically disqualifying, but heavy internal corrosion that has actually damaged the copper windings themselves is what genuinely kills the value, since a motor that can't be rewound or restored to functional condition is worth far less to a serious restorer than one that still runs or can be easily brought back to running order. Number 4 is the old ceiling fan motor, a category that gets overlooked constantly because people assume ceiling fans are a much more modern invention, or that anything old enough to be genuinely interesting would have been removed and discarded decades ago during some past renovation. In reality, some genuinely early ceiling fan motors survive in barns, wraparound porches, and old commercial storefronts, sometimes still mounted in their original location gathering dust, and sometimes sitting disconnected in a storage room after a renovation that swapped in something more modern without anyone bothering to. actually discard the old unit. These motors, particularly ones with exposed brass components and heavy cast iron mounting brackets, appeal to the same collector community drawn to desk and floor fans, and in some cases command even more interest, because ceiling models from certain early manufacturers are genuinely rarer than their tabletop counterparts, simply because fewer have survived decades of being mounted, exposed to weather, and subjected to the wear of constant use in porches and commercial spaces. The identification clue is again the badge or cast nameplate, along with the specific style of the mounting bracket and blade arms, since certain bracket and arm designs are strongly associated with specific manufacturing eras and can help narrow down a production date even when other markings have worn away. Condition concerns mirror those of desk fans in most respects. Original finish, intact and unbent blades, and a motor that turns freely by hand all support higher value, while replacement blades that don't match the original style, non-matching hardware from later repairs, and heavy corrosion from years of outdoor exposure all work against it, sometimes severely enough to turn a potentially valuable piece into little more than a curiosity. Number 3 is the small appliance motor, the kind found inside old mixers, blenders, and other kitchen or shop gadgets that eventually broke down and got disassembled for parts, leaving just the bare motor sitting in a drawer, a bin, or a forgotten box in the garage. This is one of the most commonly overlooked categories on this entire list because these motors are small, plain-looking, and rarely have obvious external branding once they've been removed from their original housing and separated from whatever gadget they once powered. Most people assume a tiny motor like this is essentially worthless, and honestly, in most individual cases, that assumption turns out to be correct. But there are specific, meaningful exceptions worth knowing about. Motors from certain early, well-documented kitchen appliance lines are sought after by collectors restoring those specific appliances, especially in situations where the original motor inside a rare vintage mixer or blender has failed, and a period-correct replacement is needed to keep the overall restoration authentic rather than settling for an obviously modern substitute that would undermine the whole project. The identification clue here requires more digging than most other items on this list, since branding may only appear as a small stamped code rather than a full, readable nameplate, meaning some genuine research into manufacturer codes and part numbering systems may be necessary before you can confirm exactly what you're actually holding in your hand. This is a case where value depends heavily on locating the right specialized buyer rather than the object having broad, universal appeal the way a beautiful brass fan does, which is worth understanding clearly before getting your hopes up about a small anonymous motor pulled from some long-forgotten mystery appliance. Number 2 is the old phonograph or record player motor, specifically the spring wound or early electric motors that once turned the turntables on wind-up and early electric phonographs, the machines that filled American parlors with music decades before anyone had heard the word stereo. These motors are frequently separated from their original cabinets over the years, either because the cabinet itself was damaged beyond repair or because someone salvaged the motor for a homemade project and left the rest behind. People overlook these motors because, once removed from their ornate wooden housing, they look like nothing more than a flat metal mechanism with a spring or small electric drive attached, easy to mistake for random hardware rather than something with real collector interest. But phonograph collectors, a genuinely dedicated and detail-oriented community, actively search for correct period motors to complete restorations of antique record players and gramophones, since a motor mismatched to its cabinet or a modern substitute crudely fitted into an antique case immediately signals an incomplete or compromised restoration to anyone with real expertise in the field. The identification clue involves checking for a manufacturer's stamp or label on the motor board itself, along with distinctive governor mechanisms for spring wound versions that vary noticeably between manufacturers and can help pin down both the maker and the approximate production era. Condition assessment focuses on whether the spring, if present, is intact and not broken or badly rusted, whether the speed-regulating governor mechanism still functions smoothly, and whether the motor board itself is free of significant warping or water damage. A motor in working or easily restorable condition, especially one matching a well-known and desirable phonograph model, can be genuine, lie valuable to the right buyer, while a rusted, broken, or badly incomplete example may only be worth a fraction of that to anyone other than someone using it purely for spare parts. Number 1, the object most likely to genuinely surprise you is the early battery-powered or direct current motor. Specifically, small motors built before household alternating current became the standardized norm. Back when battery power or early direct current systems ran the very first electric appliances to appear in American homes. These are the rarest survivors on this entire list, precisely because they're old enough to predate the standardized electrical systems most of us grew up with entirely, meaning fewer were ever made in the first place. Fewer have survived the intervening century, and most people who encounter one today have absolutely no way of correctly identifying what they're actually looking at. If you've got an old motor that seems unusually small, unusually ornate for its size, with delicate-looking brass components and a level of construction that feels almost jewelry-like compared to the heavier, more industrial motors we've already discussed throughout this list, it may fall into this rare category. Collectors specializing in truly early electrical devices treat well-documented, verifiable examples from this era as genuinely important historical pieces, not merely decorative curiosities to be casually displayed on a shelf. And confirmed rare examples in excellent condition have, in documented cases, sold for prices that would genuinely astonish anyone who assumed all old motors are basically interchangeable scrap metal. The identification process here is by far the most demanding on this entire list, often requiring careful comparison against documented manufacturer catalogs or direct consultation with specialists in early electrical history. Since markings on objects this old may be worn smooth, incomplete, or simply unfamiliar even to experienced general antique dealers who handle a wide variety of other categories. If you think you might genuinely have something like this sitting in your possession, the smart move is absolutely not to clean it aggressively or attempt to force it to run, since overcleaning can strip away original finish and patina that matters enormously to specialist collectors evaluating authenticity, and instead to photograph it carefully from multiple angles and seek out someone who specializes specifically in early electrical antiques before doing anything else to it that might be difficult or impossible to undo. So there you have it. 10 categories of old motors and small machines that might be sitting completely ignored in a garage, barn, closet, or basement right now, disguised as nothing more than heavy, outdated junk that nobody has quite gotten around to throwing away. The lesson here isn't that every old motor is secretly worth a fortune, because honestly, most aren't, and it would be irresponsible to suggest otherwise just to generate excitement. The real lesson is that this entire category survives specifically because it looks worthless to the average person, which means genuine, original, historically significant pieces are still out there sitting in ordinary homes rather than locked away safely in institutional collections where they'd never cross paths with someone stumbling onto them by accident. If you've got old motors sitting around your own property, the smart first step is simple, careful observation. Look for a nameplate or badge. Note the manufacturer name if there is one clearly visible. Check whether the motor still turns freely by hand without excessive resistance, and resist the strong urge to immediately clean, paint, or otherwise fix up anything until you actually know what you're holding, because well-meaning restoration performed too early is one of the fastest ways to destroy exactly the kind of originality that serious collectors are willing to pay a real premium to preserve. Take some clear, well-lit photographs from multiple angles, including close-ups of any markings, nameplates, or stamps you can find, and do a little targeted research, or reach out to a relevant collector community before deciding whether something is genuine trash, genuine treasure, or, as is honestly most often the case, somewhere pleasantly in between those two extremes. It's also worth remembering that value in this world isn't only about dollars and cents. Plenty of these motors and machines represent real engineering history, physical objects that connect directly back to the earliest days of household electrification in this country, when having a working motor of any kind in your home was itself a genuine novelty worth showing off to neighbors. Even a piece that turns out to be relatively common, with modest resale value on the open market, can still be worth preserving, cleaning up carefully, and displaying simply because of what it represents. Not everything va. valuable needs to translate directly into a price tag, though it's certainly satisfying when it does. If you went and checked your garage, basement, or barn while watching this, drop a comment and let us know what you found, even if it turned out to be nothing particularly special. Because honestly, half the fun of this hobby is simply learning to actually look at the objects you've walked past 1,000 times without ever really seeing them for what they are. And if this kind of hidden value hunt is something you genuinely enjoy, there's a lot more sitting quietly in kitchens, workshops, and barns across the country, still waiting patiently to be correctly identified by someone willing to take a second, closer look.